The last of the sunlight bled from the sky, leaving us cloaked in a darkness that felt thick and suffocating. The towering pines of Evergreen National Forest seemed to bend inward, pressing down on our small campfire, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I felt the weight of being miles away from civilization. The stillness was unnatural, the kind that feels alive, as though the forest itself had its own pulse, its own secrets it guarded jealously. Our group was unusually quiet. Derek was sitting cross-legged, poking at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks that disappeared into the night sky. Jake and Amber were curled up together under a single blanket, their faces half lit by the flickering flames. Jen sat next to me, her hands clenched in her lap, staring out into the surrounding darkness. "I read that this place is haunted," Derek said, breaking the silence. His voice carried a forced nonchalance, like he was trying to pretend he wasn't freaked out. "The trees whisper to you, right? Like they're warning you about something." Amber rolled her eyes, though she shifted closer to Jake. "That's just some dumb story to scare campers." "Maybe," Derek continued, "but they say people have gone missing here. The whispers try to warn you, but if you hear them, it's already too late. It's like the forest has you trapped." "Enough," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Everyone turned to look at me. I managed a shaky laugh. "We're out here to have fun, not freak each other out." But despite my words, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled into my bones. The fire crackled and hissed, casting long shadows that danced along the tree line, and suddenly, I found myself listening, really listening. The wind sighed through the pines, but it sounded different now, like a long, mournful exhale. Jen leaned in, her voice so low that only I could hear it. "Logan, do you hear that?" I strained my ears. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I caught it. A faint whisper threading its way through the trees, a voice that seemed to shift and slide, just out of comprehension. My skin prickled, and I tried to convince myself it was the wind, nothing more. But when the whisper grew clearer, more distinct, my breath caught in my throat. It said my name. "Logan." I flinched, my heart thudding. Did it just say my name? Jen's grip on my arm tightened, her fingers ice cold. "It did," she whispered, her voice trembling. Amber and Jake had stopped whispering to each other, their faces pale. "Are you guys messing with us?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked at the edges. "None of us are messing around," Derek said, his bravado faltering. He stood abruptly, tossing his stick into the fire. "I'm done sitting here. Let's take a walk, clear our heads." But no one moved. We were frozen in place, our ears tuned to the sounds of the forest. The whisper came again, stronger this time, more insistent. "Logan, Jen, Amber, Jake, Derek." Amber let out a strangled gasp and buried her face against Jake's chest. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I stood, legs trembling. It's probably some prank," I said, but I didn't believe my own words. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, playing tricks on us? And how did they know our names? Derek grabbed his flashlight and swung it in a wide arc, illuminating nothing but shadows and towering pines. "If this is a joke," he shouted into the darkness, "it's not funny." The forest swallowed his voice. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on us like a tangible thing. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, there was a rustling sound, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Amber whispered, clutching Jake's arm so hard he winced. Jake swallowed. "We need to pack up and leave," he said. "Right now." Before any of us could move, there was a sudden movement in the shadows. A man stumbled into the circle of light cast by our campfire, his face gaunt and eyes wide with terror. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and he looked like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands clutching at the dirt. "Please," he croaked, his voice raw. "You have to get out. You're not safe." My pulse raced as I stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man looked up, his eyes unfocused and wild. "We thought it was just stories too," he said, almost babbling. "My friends and I. We got lost. The forest wouldn't let us go. It twists around you, traps you. You think you're going the right way, but it's a lie. And the whispers, they try to help, but it's too late." "What happened to your friends?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's face contorted with grief. "Gone," he whispered. "Taken by it." He clutched at his head, sobbing. "It's out there. It's always out there." Before we could get more out of him, he lurched to his feet and stumbled back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as he had come. The whispers picked up again, louder now, almost frantic. "We have to go," Jake said, his voice breaking. "We can't stay here." We scrambled to pack up our things, our movements jerky and desperate. But when we tried to head back down the path we had come, we froze in horror. The trail was gone. Where there had been a clear route leading back to our car, there was now only an impenetrable wall of trees. This isn't possible," Derek whispered. Panic set in. We spun around, searching for any sign of the path. But the forest seemed to have shifted around us, closing us in. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Logan," Jen whispered, pulling me close. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. "I think it's real." The whispering intensified, and for a moment, I thought I could make out individual voices, each one full of fear and sorrow. They weren't just trying to scare us. They were pleading with us. Then came a new sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to echo from the ground itself. The shadows in the forest shifted, thickening, and I realized with a sickening jolt that something was moving between the trees. Something big. Amber clutched Jake, her breathing ragged. "What is that?" The growl came again, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "We need to run," I whispered. "Now." We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted through the forest, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the shadows chasing us. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, warning us, guiding us. But the thing in the darkness was faster. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, each step reverberating through the ground like a heartbeat. Jen tripped, and I grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Come on," I yelled, though my voice sounded distant in my own ears. The forest opened up into a clearing, and we stumbled into the moonlight, gasping for breath. But there was no relief. The growling had stopped, but the silence felt even more ominous. "Where is it?" Derek whispered, his flashlight beam shaking as he swung it around. The shadows were deeper here, pooling around the edges of the clearing. And then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening. Something moved in the darkness, a hulking shape, twisted and unnatural, with eyes that burned like embers. It stepped into the moonlight, and my breath caught in my throat. Its form was wrong. shifting and changing as though it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. But the eyes, those burning, hungry eyes, were fixed on us. It took a step forward, and the clearing seemed to tremble. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away. The thing's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and it spoke in a voice that was a mockery of the whispers we had heard. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "You don't belong." The creature lunged, and I braced myself for the end. But then the wind picked up, howling through the clearing, and the whispers returned, louder, more desperate, like a chorus of lost souls fighting for us. The shadows seemed to recoil, and the thing stumbled back, its form flickering. I could almost see faces in the wind, ghostly shapes that surrounded the creature, holding it at bay. "Go," the whispers urged. "Now!" Jen grabbed my hand, and we ran. The forest didn't seem as dense now, and paths appeared where there had been none. We followed the guidance of the whispers, feeling them tug us forward, away from the monster, away from the endless dark. When we finally burst out onto the main road, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. We collapsed in a heap, sobbing and gasping for air. The whispers faded, leaving only the sigh of the wind through the trees. We didn't speak as we stumbled to our car. There was nothing left to say. But as we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, at the towering pines that now looked almost peaceful in the early morning light. I thought I heard a final whisper, faint but clear. "You made it. Don't come back." And I knew then that the forest was alive, a labyrinth of shadows and spirits, a place that kept its secrets close. We had escaped, but I would never forget the whispers or the thing that had lurked in the darkness, waiting for us to get lost. And as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder how many others hadn't been so lucky. How many souls still wandered those woods, whispering warnings we had nearly been too late to understand. I still can't explain exactly what happened that night, and maybe I never will. I used to think the world made sense, that every mystery could be solved with enough logic and reason. But after that camping trip, I know some legends are more than just stories, more than the ramblings of old-timers trying to scare kids around a campfire. Sometimes the monsters are real. The trip was my dad's idea. He wanted to take me and a few of my friends, his idea of a father-daughter bonding adventure. Dad had camped at Lake Hollow when he was young, and he used to tell me all these stories about it, painting it as a place of wonder. Clear waters, dense woods, and stars that filled the night sky so thickly you could almost touch them. So, one crisp autumn afternoon, we piled into Dad's old SUV, me, my dad, and my two best friends, Rachel and Chris. Rachel, with her fearless, wild grin, always the first to leap into trouble. And Chris, the steady one, a cautious boy with a love of nature and an encyclopedic knowledge of survival skills. If there was anyone you wanted with you in the woods, it was Chris. The drive up to the lake was beautiful, but eerie. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, leaves raining down like tiny flames. But as we approached the lake, an overcast sky swallowed the sun. Shadows grew long, and the air grew still, too still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. "Perfect weather for ghost stories," Dad said, grinning as he drove. His voice was casual, but I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. "What ghost stories?" Rachel asked, her interest piqued. Dad hesitated. Just some old legend about Lake Hollow," he said, as though he'd rather leave it at that. But Rachel wouldn't let it go, and soon he was telling us about the Lantern Man. "He was a fisherman," Dad said, his voice dropping to a storyteller's whisper. Long ago, he disappeared one stormy night, his lantern the only thing that could be seen, bobbing on the waves. They never found his body, but his lantern kept appearing, drifting along the shore. People say his spirit searches for something, or someone, to take back to the lake. Chris raised an eyebrow. That's comforting. Dad shrugged. It's just a story. Or maybe it's a warning. I laughed, but the sound came out thin and nervous. My dad was a rational man, not one to believe in ghost tales, yet he seemed reluctant to discuss the Lantern Man any further. When we reached the campsite, the lake spread out before us like a sheet of glass, still and perfect, reflecting the gray sky. The surrounding pines were dense, whispering secrets to each other whenever the wind rustled through their branches. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and for a few hours, it almost felt normal. The woods were quiet, but not too quiet, and the lake glistened like polished silver in the fading light. As night fell, the cold deepened, biting through our jackets. Dad cooked dinner over the fire, while Rachel and Chris debated the finer points of s'mores construction. I kept glancing at the lake, feeling a strange pull. It was beautiful, but unsettling too. There was something about its stillness, as if it were a vast, watchful eye. Dad noticed my distraction. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing me a hot dog on a stick. I shrugged. I don't know. This place just feels different. Dad's smile faded. He opened his mouth to say something, but then Rachel let out a whoop and held up a perfectly golden marshmallow, and the moment passed. It was almost midnight when the real horror began. We were gathered around the fire, wrapped in blankets, our faces lit with the flickering orange glow. Dad had wandered off to collect more firewood, and Rachel was regaling us with some nonsense story about a vengeful forest spirit. Chris was rolling his eyes when we heard it. A splash, loud and sudden, from the direction of the lake. We froze, every nerve on edge. Rachel turned to me, her grin faltering. "That was probably just a fish, right?" she said, trying to sound brave. Chris frowned. "In water that cold?" We waited, listening. The night air was heavy with tension, and then we saw it. A faint light gliding over the surface of the lake. It was golden and shuddered slightly, as if suspended in a lantern. The light bobbed once, twice, and then began to drift toward our campsite. Rachel cursed under her breath. "You've got to be kidding me." Chris grabbed my arm. "Lantern Man," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I wanted to laugh, to tell them it was just some fisherman or a trick of the light, but I couldn't. The air was too cold, the silence too complete, and the light was too real. It felt wrong. Rachel, never one to back down from a challenge, stood up. "Hey," she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Who's out there?" The lantern didn't stop. It hovered closer, swaying like it was caught on an invisible current. And then, slowly, it began to drift onto the shore. Chris pulled Rachel back, his face pale. "We should go. Now." Rachel's bravado crumbled. She nodded, and we backed away from the fire, our eyes glued to that impossible light. Just as we reached the edge of the trees, Dad appeared, a bundle of firewood in his arms. He looked at us, confused. "What's going on?" he asked. Then he saw the lantern. His face went white, and the wood slipped from his hands. "Get away from the water," he whispered. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We stumbled backward, our breath coming in short, panicked bursts, and I glanced over my shoulder to see Dad's face, etched with fear. I had never seen him look like that. He wasn't just afraid, he was terrified. The lantern stopped at the shore, flickering once, twice, and then a shape emerged from the darkness behind it. A figure, tall and thin, dripping wet. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed, reflecting the lantern's light. It stepped onto the land, water pooling around its feet, and the smell hit us, an overpowering stench of rot and lake water. "Go," Dad hissed. "Run." We bolted into the woods, branches scratching at our arms and legs, the darkness thick and suffocating. I could hear Rachel and Chris ahead of me, their footsteps frantic, and behind us, the unmistakable sound of heavy, waterlogged boots thudding against the ground. My heart raced. I didn't dare look back. The Lantern Man was real. The legend wasn't just a story. It was here, and it was hunting us. We stumbled deeper into the woods, the lantern's light a ghostly glow that never wavered, never dimmed. Dad was ahead of me now, shouting directions, but it was hard to hear him over the pounding of my own pulse. Then, without warning, Rachel tripped, landing hard on her hands and knees. I skidded to a stop, grabbing her arm and pulling her up. "Come on!" I shouted, but she was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw him," she whispered. "He was right there." Chris pulled us both forward, desperation in his voice. "We have to keep moving." But the woods had grown unfamiliar. The trees were too close together, the darkness too thick, and the whispers had started, low, mournful voices echoing through the pines. I could barely tell which direction we were running. Dad skidded to a stop in front of us, his flashlight swinging wildly. "This way," he called, pointing to the left. We followed him, but my legs were heavy, my breath ragged. The light was getting closer. I could feel it, the cold wrapping around us like invisible chains. And then, Chris stumbled. He let out a sharp cry, clutching at his ankle, and we all stopped. "Leave me," he gasped. "Just go." "No way," I said, dropping down beside him, my hands trembling as I tried to help him up. The lantern's glow was stronger now, illuminating the trees around us, casting long, twisting shadows. And then, impossibly, the whispers changed. They weren't just incoherent murmurs anymore. They were words. "Give him. Give him." The Lantern Man stepped into view, his face still shrouded in darkness, the lantern swinging in his skeletal hand. His wet clothes clung to his frame, and his breath rattled in his chest, like the death rattle of something long drowned. His eyes, glowing and empty, fixed on Chris. Rachel screamed, the sound ripping through the woods, and Dad grabbed her, pulling her back. But Chris was frozen, his eyes locked with the Lantern Man's. "Give him what?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The Lantern Man took a step forward, the light illuminating his ghastly, waterlogged face, and the whispers came again, clearer this time. "Give him peace." And then I understood. He wasn't looking for someone to take. He was looking for something we couldn't give, a peace that had eluded him for too long. "Run," Dad whispered, his voice thick with grief. "Run, now." I pulled Chris to his feet, tears streaming down my face, and we ran. We ran until our legs gave out, until we were far from the lantern's light, far from the lake, far from the whispered words. When we finally collapsed, exhausted and trembling, the woods had grown silent again, as though nothing had ever disturbed them. We found our way back to the main road by morning, stumbling into the light like lost souls. Dad never spoke of the Lantern Man again, and neither did we. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, still feel the cold, and I know the Lantern Man is still out there, still searching for something he'll never find. I don't go back to Lake Hollow anymore, and I never will. Some legends are real, and some monsters never rest. We should never have come to those woods. I tell myself that all the time, though it doesn't change anything. When I close my eyes, I can still see the twisting, shadow-drenched forest that swallowed us whole, the way the sunlight fractured through the leaves and made the world seem both beautiful and menacing. But we were young and reckless, eager for adventure. We thought the legends about the Vanishing Trail were just stories, the kind you tell around a campfire to scare the uninitiated. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? A bunch of 20-somethings, convinced we're invincible, out to make memories we could laugh about later. Only, there's nothing funny about what happened that weekend, and there never will be. It was my idea to go camping. I'd heard about Blackwood National Forest, and how it had become a kind of whispered legend among hikers. People said the trails there had a way of changing, of luring you deeper into the wilderness until you were hopelessly lost. A few disappearances over the years had added fuel to the fire, but no bodies had ever been found. The stories felt distant, exaggerated. I liked the thrill of it. I convinced my friends, Aiden, Marcus, and Lila, that it would be an adventure. Aiden, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes but agreed. Marcus was the go-along-to-get-along type, always happy to be included. And Lila, well, Lila trusted me. We'd been best friends since we were kids, and even though I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, she never said no to me. We packed up my old SUV and drove out early on a Friday morning, the car heavy with our gear and laughter. The forest welcomed us with a crisp autumn chill, and the trail we set out on was beautiful, lined with trees that stood tall and quiet, like ancient guardians. "I don't see what the big deal is," Aiden said, kicking a rock off the path. "It's just a bunch of trees. People probably got lost because they weren't paying attention." Lila glanced at me, her eyes narrowing with playful suspicion. "You didn't drag us out here just for a haunted hike, did you?" I laughed, though the sound was thinner than I intended. "Nah," I said. "It's just a story. But you know, a little mystery never hurt anyone." Marcus grinned. "Yeah, except for all the people who disappeared." We all laughed, and for a while, the forest seemed welcoming. We found a clearing to set up camp, the sun streaming down through the canopy in golden shafts. It felt like a good day. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and let the afternoon slip into evening. The light began to wane, and shadows stretched longer, but we didn't notice. It was Lila who first sensed something was off. As dusk fell, she stood at the edge of our campsite, staring into the woods. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice hushed. We all stopped, our laughter dying. Aiden frowned. "Hear what?" Lila didn't answer, but I strained to listen. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, chirping insects, seemed muted, swallowed by the looming darkness. The silence was unsettling, almost suffocating, but then Marcus let out a nervous chuckle. "It's just the woods, Lila. You're letting Logan's scary stories get to you." But Lila didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on something in the trees. "I thought I heard footsteps," she whispered. A shiver crawled down my spine, but I forced a smile. "Probably just a deer," I said. "This place is full of wildlife." She nodded, but her unease didn't dissipate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As night swallowed the forest, we built a fire and huddled around it, the flames dancing and throwing shadows that seemed to leap and twist just beyond the circle of light. We cooked dinner, joked, and tried to keep the fear at bay. But there was no ignoring the sensation that the woods were closing in. "I swear the trees look closer," Aiden said, his voice cracking. He forced a laugh, but it fell flat. I was about to tease him, to break the tension, when Marcus went pale. "Wait, where's the trail?" We all looked. The path we had walked in on, the clear and obvious trail that had led us here, was gone. In its place was a dense wall of trees and underbrush, tangled and impenetrable. "What the hell?" I whispered, my throat tightening. Lila turned to me, her eyes wide. "Logan, this isn't funny." "I didn't do anything," I protested, though my hands were already trembling. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, sweeping the beam across the tree line. The woods seemed to shift and sway, the light catching on twisted branches and nothing more. Aiden jumped up, trying to sound confident. "We probably just got turned around. It's dark, and shadows play tricks on you." But Marcus wasn't buying it. "We didn't move, Aiden. The trail was right there." His voice quavered, panic seeping through the cracks. We decided to spread out just a little, flashlights in hand, to search for the path. The night air was freezing now, colder than it should have been, and I couldn't help but feel we were trespassing somewhere. We weren't welcome. As I moved through the trees, the feeling of being watched intensified, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest was too quiet. That's when I heard it. Whispering. I froze, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The whispers were faint, almost like a breeze, but they carried words. "Turn back. Turn back." I swallowed hard and whipped my flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just trees, gnarled and ancient, standing like silent sentinels. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I stumbled back toward the campsite, my mind racing. When I found the others, they looked as shaken as I felt. Aiden was pacing, his jaw clenched. "This isn't right," he said. "Trails don't just disappear." "Maybe we should try to leave now," Lila suggested, her voice breaking. "Just pack up and go." Marcus nodded, already shoving things into his backpack. "Yes, before it gets worse." But as we scrambled to gather our things, the whispers grew louder. "You can't leave. You're already lost." Lila dropped her flashlight, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" We all heard it. The whispers surrounded us, echoing from every direction. Aiden's face twisted in disbelief. "Okay, someone's messing with us. This has to be a joke." But it was no joke. The forest was alive, shifting around us. The trees seemed to breathe, closing in. Shadows slithered and danced in the corners of my vision, and no matter how hard we tried to retrace our steps, the path stayed hidden. We walked in circles for hours, our panic growing with every passing minute. Aiden was muttering under his breath, cursing and blaming the forest, and Marcus had gone silent, his eyes wide and unfocused. Lila clung to my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How can this be happening?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were trapped, ensnared by something we couldn't see or comprehend. And then we found the carvings. Deep, jagged marks in the trunks of the trees, forming symbols and arrows. They pointed in different directions, each one leading deeper into the woods. "What are these?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. Lila examined one of the symbols, her eyes wide with horror. They're "They're fresh," she said. "Someone was just here." But there was no one. Only the whispers, growing more insistent. "This way. No, that way. Follow me." Aiden snapped, swinging his flashlight wildly. "Shut up!" he screamed at the darkness. "Just shut up!" The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath. But then, in the distance, we heard it. A low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold, and I knew, with a certainty that made my knees weak, that we weren't alone. Something was out there, hunting us. We ran, blind and terrified, crashing through the underbrush. The whispers followed us, frantic now, and I could have sworn I felt fingers brushing against my arms, pulling me in different directions. Lila tripped, and I hauled her up, my heart pounding. "We have to keep moving," I shouted, but Marcus had stopped, his eyes fixed on something behind us. "It's him," he whispered, his voice thin and empty. "The lost hiker." I turned, and there, in the shadows, was a figure. A man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his clothes tattered and his hands covered in dirt. He raised one hand, pointing at us, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Lila pulled me backward, sobbing. "Logan, we need to get out of here." But there was nowhere to go. The forest had swallowed us, and the trail was gone. We stumbled through the woods, lost in a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, until finally we collapsed, exhausted and broken. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. The forest remained dense and unyielding, and the path never reappeared. Days blurred together, and we grew weaker, haunted by the whispers, by the shadowy figure that always seemed to watch us from a distance. We never found our way out. It started as a trip meant to clear our minds, an escape from the suffocating monotony of city life. 3 days out in the woods, camping by the shores of Blackthorn Lake, miles from the nearest town and any trace of civilization. It sounded perfect, especially for Sam, who was on the brink of losing his job, and for Maggie, who needed to shake off the memories of her last toxic relationship. And me, the quiet one, the observer, who thought nature might offer the peace I craved. But peace wasn't what we found at Blackthorn Lake. What we found, I can't explain. It lingers in my dreams, in the chill that grips me whenever I pass a still body of water, and in the haunting sound of a lake that never truly sleeps. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun warm on our faces and the sky a brilliant blue. Maggie hung out of the car window, her long red hair streaming behind her as she took in the towering pines and the shimmer of the lake through the trees. Sam parked the Jeep, and we piled out, eager to explore. The lake was beautiful, nestled in a basin surrounded by forested hills. It was so still that it looked like a sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting everything around it. The only movement came from a pair of loons gliding silently across the water. "Wow," Maggie said, standing at the water's edge. "It's almost too perfect, you know?" I stood beside her, feeling the odd sense of unease that comes from too much beauty. It was as though the lake was holding its breath, as though something beneath its surface lay in wait. But Sam's laughter shattered my dark thoughts. He was already pulling out the tents, making jokes about his lack of camping skills. We set up camp in a small clearing close to the lake, a perfect spot with a fire pit someone had built long ago. We cooked hot dogs and drank cheap beer, and for a while, it felt good. It felt right. The sun dipped below the treetops, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and the lake caught every color, shimmering in the dying light. Sam pulled out his guitar, strumming lazily, and Maggie and I sang along, our voices blending with the evening breeze. The first sign of something wrong came when the sun finally disappeared and darkness claimed the woods. The loons, which had been calling to each other all afternoon, suddenly went silent. The wind died, and the night air grew heavy, pressing down on us. Maggie shivered. "It feels weird, doesn't it?" she whispered, as if afraid to speak too loudly. Sam stopped playing, his fingers hovering over the strings. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I guess it does." I tried to shake it off. "It's just the wilderness," I said, though I couldn't ignore the prickle of anxiety that was creeping up my spine. City kids like us aren't used to this kind of quiet. But it wasn't just the quiet. It was the sense that we were being watched. Maggie stood up, brushing dirt from her jeans. "I'm getting more firewood," she announced, and I noticed how tense she was, her usual confidence shaken. "I'll come with you," Sam said, setting his guitar aside. They disappeared into the trees, their flashlight beams bobbing, and I sat alone by the fire, staring out at the lake. It was darker now, the surface a black mirror. The trees along the shore seemed taller, more oppressive, and the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, when I heard it. A faint splash, far out on the lake. My head snapped up, my heart pounding. The water was still, unbroken, but I knew what I'd heard. Another splash followed, louder this time, closer to shore. My pulse raced, and I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. "Sam?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Maggie?" No answer. The fire crackled, a sound that suddenly felt small and fragile against the vast darkness. I pointed the flashlight at the lake, and the beam cut through the night, illuminating the surface. At first, I saw nothing, just the still water and the jagged reflections of the trees. But then, movement. A ripple, gentle but deliberate, spreading out from a point in the center of the lake. I squinted, trying to see more, but the ripple vanished, leaving the lake as still as death. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I tried to convince myself it was a fish, a loon, anything mundane. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. "Hey!" Maggie's voice startled me, and I jumped, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. She and Sam emerged from the woods, their arms loaded with sticks. Maggie frowned at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Just thought I heard something in the lake." Sam dumped the firewood and grabbed a beer. "Maybe it's the ghost of a fish, coming back to haunt you," he joked, but his laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. We built the fire higher, but the unease never lifted. The night pressed in around us, and every noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made us jump. Maggie kept glancing over her shoulder, and Sam's usual humor grew strained. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned low, and we were on the verge of heading to our tents, that we heard it. A whisper, a soft, shivering voice that drifted out from the lake, carrying a plea that made my blood run cold. "Help me." Maggie and I locked eyes, and I knew she had heard it too. Sam froze, his beer halfway to his lips. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I stood up, my legs shaking. "Someone's out there," I said, though the words felt wrong. How could anyone be out there, in the middle of the lake, in the dead of night? We grabbed our flashlights and stumbled down to the water's edge, our breath fogging in the freezing air. The lake was calm, eerily so, but the whisper came again, clearer this time. Please, help me. Maggie clutched my arm. We have to do something, she said, her voice breaking. Sam shone his flashlight out over the water. Hey, he called, his voice echoing. Are you okay? Where are you? No answer. Just the whisper, over and over, as if on a loop. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. A shape, floating just beneath the surface. It looked like a face, pale and featureless, and as I stared, it drifted closer, until it was only a few feet from shore. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The face sank, disappearing into the darkness below, and the whisper stopped. What was that? Sam demanded, grabbing my shoulder. Did you see it? I couldn't speak. My heart felt like it was about to burst, and my vision blurred with panic. Maggie's grip on my arm was bruising, her nails digging into my skin. We need to leave, she said, her voice shaking. Right now. We backed away from the lake, stumbling over rocks and roots, and gathered what little we could carry. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and hurried movements. We packed up the tents with trembling hands, too afraid to take our eyes off the water. The lake seemed to watch us, to pull us in, and the whisper still echoed in my ears, even though it had stopped. As we threw our gear into the Jeep, Sam turned to look at the lake one last time. His face was pale, his hands clenching and unclenching. We're going to tell people about this, right? He asked, but there was no conviction in his voice. Maggie shook her head. Who would believe us? I didn't have an answer. We left Blackthorn Lake behind, our tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. The forest closed around the road, and I could feel the weight of the lake's gaze, pressing against my back, refusing to let me go. We never talked about it again. Not really. We tried, in the weeks that followed, but words felt hollow and inadequate. The fear lingered, though, and I knew we had left a part of ourselves behind, something the lake had claimed. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that whisper. I hear it calling from the depths, a voice full of sorrow and longing. And in those dreams, I see the face beneath the water, pale and empty, watching me with eyes that never close. Blackthorn Lake is still there, a perfect mirror in the woods, silent and waiting. I wonder if anyone else has heard the whisper, if anyone else has felt the lake's cold grip. I wonder if one day I'll go back, drawn by a pull I can't resist. But I know one thing for certain. The lake never sleeps, and some things should be left undisturbed.